Hi, everybody. Thank you for being with us today. My name is David Harrison. It's my privilege to serve as president of Columbus State Community College. And we're delighted to welcome you to our virtual summit of the Central Ohio Compact. One of the habits that we've started at Columbus State during this pandemic is to start every meeting with gratitude. And I want to do that today. I want to start by thanking Tom Goodney and the great team at the Educational Service Center of Central Ohio. Tom and his team have been Columbus State's shoulder-to-shoulder partner from the very beginning of our work with the Central Ohio Compact. I want to thank our panel of experts that are leading us through today. I want to thank Christy Angel, CEO of the YWCA. I want to thank Joy Bivins, Deputy County Administrator for Health and Human Services. Joy just got promoted, so I wanted to make sure I got her title right. I want to thank Melvin Brown, Superintendent of Reynoldsburg Schools. I also want to thank Charles Noble of Columbus State. Charles joined our team back in March, the day before the governor sent us all home because of COVID-19. He has done a great job of helping us through various aspects of our response to the pandemic. He's done a great job of helping us put together our own diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. And he jumped in eagerly to help put this program together, both for today and for next week. So Charles, thank you very much. Some of you have been with us before at our summits for the Central Ohio Compact. And I know for some of you, this is new. So I want to give a little bit of an overview of what the Compact is for those of you who may be new. This is actually our 10th year of doing these summits. Typically, we've got 300 people in the ballroom at Columbus State working through the big issues of the day. So again, we're glad you're here with us today. This started very informally. Again, 10 years ago, having conversations with superintendents and university presidents and looking at data and recognizing that there were gaps in our collective data in our community. We were losing students in transitions, the transition from K-12 to post-secondary, the transition from the community college to universities, and the transition from post-secondary to employers. So we started to get together to decide, to discuss what we might be able to do about it. And again, we started by looking at data, by confronting the hard facts and recognizing that we could do more together than any of our organizations could do individually. That really became the basis for the Central Ohio Compact. So in 2012, we started to write some things down and put a regional strategy together that became the basis for the Central Ohio Compact. We adopted, at the time, the Lumina Foundation's 60% goal to have 60% of adults hold a post-secondary credential by 2025. Later, the Ohio Department of Higher Education adopted that statewide around a 65% goal. And the Compact adopted ODHE's 65% goal. And we've been holding ourselves accountable to that progress since then. We've expanded our coalition over time. We started with K-12 and higher ed working closely together. Then we added employers into the mix, which was an important step in our collective impact approach. And more recently, we've added human service leaders, social service leaders into the conversation to help address non-academic barriers. It's an informal group. We don't have a formal governance process. We don't have a board. We talk about the coalition of the willing. It's folks getting together around a common cause to see how we could work together, how we can do more together than any of us or organizations can do individually. Equity has always been a priority for the Compact, and we've made progress. Within the construct of the Central Ohio Compact, we've got more students of color earning college degrees than we had before. We've got more students of color participating in College Credit Plus than we had before. At Columbus State, we've made significant improvements in closing performance gaps for low-income students and students of color. We had our largest and most diverse graduating class in the college's history last year, at a time when our enrollment is nowhere near historic highs. We've made progress, but it's not enough. This summer, we had a lot of conversations with superintendents and college presidents, really just check-ins to see how folks were doing and to see how we might help each other out, how we can work together. There wasn't a formal agenda, but we did talk about our priorities. And the priorities weren't our response to COVID-19. It wasn't the impact that the pandemic was having on our budgets. It was around racial injustice and systemic racism. So those conversations led to this conversation. It was apparent that the focus of this year's summit, albeit virtual, needed to be around racial injustice and systemic racism. So we connected with community leaders to put this program together. We thought it was important that we connect with conversations that were already happening in the community so that we could learn together. Look at this as a conversation starter. This week and next week is really to frame a more in-depth and ongoing discussion. We'll share a lot of data today. It'll be uncomfortable, and that's okay. At Columbus State, we talk a lot about the purpose of data is to make decisions. Keep that in mind as we go through today's program together and as we learn together. The Central Ohio Compact has a strong track record of working together to eliminate barriers to success for students and families. One of the things I love about this collective impact partnership is that we've got a bias toward action. What if we take that same collective impact approach and point it toward systemic racism? As you see today's data and you learn from the experts today, ask yourself, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it as individuals? What are we going to do about it within our organizations? What are we going to do about it as a community? Before I turn it over to my friend Charles Noble, we'll start with a short video from the YWCA's Activists and Agitators Racial Equity Training. It'll give us a baseline of various forms of racism through common terminology and specific examples. Thank you for joining this important conversation today. I look forward to working with you.
We find it important to begin this conversation with a land and labor acknowledgement, acknowledging and celebrating the indigenous people of the region and recognizing the imperial and colonial violence that the U.S. brought to bear against them in the name of acculturation, religious conversion, exploration, and manifest destiny. When doing equity and social justice-based work, it is important that we acknowledge the complicated history we have as a nation with the concepts of justice, liberty, and freedom. And while those watching at home might be located all across Ohio and beyond, we want to acknowledge that if we were to meet in person at YWCA Columbus's historic downtown building, we would be gathering on the traditional territory of Hopewell, Shawnee, and Miami nations. It is important to understand the long-standing history that has brought you to reside on the land and to seek to understand your place within that history. Colonialism is a current, ongoing process, and we all need to build mindfulness of our own present participation in that process. We also pay homage to our ancestors and the generations of agitators that came before us, whose resistance and struggle laid the groundwork for our activism today and influences our path towards collective liberation.
It is important to acknowledge that although the concepts we will be discussing impact and apply to other racial minorities, for the purpose of today's discussion, we will be centering the conversation around anti-Black racism. At the present time, especially amid ongoing protests against police brutality and continued anti-Black vigilantism, it is evident that our country's relationship with Black citizens warrants comprehensive systemic change. We cannot begin to repair harm and move towards justice without specifically calling out the historical and ongoing traumas of anti-Black racism. That is the framework through which we will approach today's conversation. Previously, we recommended that participants bring a blank sheet of paper with them to this training. If you have one handy, we encourage you to get it out and participate with us in this next exercise. First, turn your paper to landscape view. Fold it in half, crease in the center, then open it back up. Next, fold the right edge to the crease in the middle, crease it, and leave it folded. Finally, fold the smaller right folded area in half to the crease, then open the sheet all the way. This is meant to represent a timeline of Black American history. The far left side is the year 1619, when enslavement began. The far right represents 2020. So the span of the paper represents the 400-year period from when slavery began until now. Take a look at your paper. The very far left section and the first smaller segment represent the timeline of legal enslavement. The next two sections are meant to represent the brief period of Reconstruction and Jim Crow. The final, smallest segment is meant to represent the 56 years since the Civil Rights era. Enslavement and Jim Crow represent 345 years, or 86% of the Black American experience. In order to address the wrongs of our past and bring equity to our future, we must acknowledge the foundational and recent impact of racist policy in our country and the role government plays in maintaining the racist structure of our institutions today. An exercise like this helps us to keep a correct perspective of the racial disparities we see around us, looking beyond the distracting narrative of racism being just a few bad apples, and directly into the creation and enforcement of policy intentionally designed to subjugate and oppress African American people for over 400 years. The road to an equitable future must be lined with an acknowledgement of the past.
As we begin today's conversation, it is important to start by saying that foundationally, we have to change our understanding of racism and what it means to be racist. Many of us today have been socialized to understand racism as an intentional act of meanness towards a person because of their race. We often focus on acts of individual racism that we hear about in the media or directly experience. While these attacks are deeply harmful, the system of racism is much more pervasive and far-reaching. If we limit our discussion to racism on an interpersonal level, we end up narrowing in on the impact of individual bad apples, and our solution to racism becomes simply about individual punishment. However, as time has proven, racism cannot be eliminated by exclusively focusing on individual acts. In fact, one of the ways our society upholds racism is by continuing to zero in only on individual racism instead of critically examining the ways in which white supremacy is woven throughout the policies, values, and norms of our institutions and culture. Americans grow up being influenced by a non-inclusive narrative of our country's history and are inundated with bias, misinformation, and stereotypes in the media that carry deep-rooted and damaging messages about people of color. It can feel uncomfortable acknowledging the centuries of advantage awarded to white people and the extreme disadvantage put on people of color, especially because, as Americans, we have been asked to believe in the myth of meritocracy, the American dream, the pull yourself up from your bootstraps mentality, believing that if we just try hard enough, we can succeed, and therefore those who don't succeed according to societal standards are just not trying hard enough. Yet for many in our country, this belief neglects to account for the state-sanctioned discrimination upheld through centuries of racist policy that serve as roadblocks on the path to equality. Some white folks reject the acknowledgement of their racial privilege because they see it as taking away from their own merit or accomplishments, or conversely, diminishing their own life struggles. It may be helpful to realize that while benefiting from white privilege doesn't mean someone hasn't struggled or worked hard, it means that the color of their skin isn't one of the things making life harder. When we understand racism as a system that we have all been socialized into and that its influence is pervasive, it stops us from centering the conversation on our feelings and ego, good versus bad, racist versus not racist. You can believe you are a socially conscious, kind person and still accept that you have learned unconscious biases from a lifetime of being saturated in structural racism. The two are not mutually exclusive. Instead, that understanding transforms guilt and shame into an awareness of, I have it, I have been socialized into it, so what am I going to do to act against it? When we recognize that racism operates at the individual and structural levels, we can move beyond personal racialized anxiety and focus on institutional and structural change. So let's explore that further and define a few important terms. First, let's all get familiar with the different forms of racism. I like to use the landscape of our city as a metaphor to help explain. When thinking about our city's landscape, individual racism is like the room we're all sitting in. It's our immediate context. Individual racism is the prejudgment, bias, or discrimination by an individual based on race, and includes both internalized racism, which is our private beliefs and biases about race and racism that are influenced by our culture, and interpersonal racism, which occurs when we interact with others and our private racial beliefs affect our public interactions. An example of individual racism is the recent Facebook video that went viral, where a Black man was birdwatching and asked a white woman to put her dog on a leash, as required by park rules. The two engaged in a conversation that quickly escalated, so the Black man started filming their encounter, stating he did so because Black men are often seen as targets. Soon thereafter, the white woman called the police, saying, "I'm going to tell them an African-American man is threatening my life." The man in question had not threatened her, yet her bias led her to assume he was a danger to her because of his race, and she quickly weaponized the threat of law enforcement as a way to gain power in the situation, knowing that disclosing his race might elicit an extreme and potentially violent response. So if individual racism is like the room we're sitting in, institutional racism is like the building this room is in. It's the policies and practices that shape how we live our lives. Institutional racism is discriminatory treatment, unfair policies, and inequitable opportunities based on race produced and perpetuated by institutions. Individuals within institutions then take on the power of the institution when they act in ways that advantage and disadvantage people based on race. Racism is built into the policies and everyday practices of the healthcare system, the education system, the criminal justice system, and housing and job markets, just to name a few. That means that it operates both systematically and without the need for intentional individual racist acts. People can simply be following the rules and produce outcomes that benefit white people and harm Black people because the rules are set up to reproduce racism. An example of modern-day institutional racism is racial profiling within policing, like the stop and frisk tactic used by New York Police Department. African Americans make up 25% of New York City's population, yet between 2010 and 2012, 52% of those stopped by the NYPD during stop and frisk were Black. White New Yorkers are 44% of the city's population, but only 9% of those stopped were white. When police officers stop Black people on suspicion of committing a crime without evidence, they engage in institutional racism because they are representing a law enforcement institution with policies and practices that disproportionately disadvantage Black people, like stop and frisk and no-knock warrants. So then the cumulative impact of individual and institutional racism within our society creates a system of structural racism. So if individual racism is like the room we're all sitting in, institutional racism is like the building the room is in, and structural racism is the skyline of the buildings all around us, all of which interact to dictate our outcomes. Structural racism encompasses history and current reality of institutional racism across all institutions, combining to create a system that negatively impacts communities of color. The racist policies and practices within institutions then overlap and amplify the different treatment that people of color receive compared to that which white people receive, ensuring different life outcomes. Structural racism requires us to question our orientation to how we explain current racial disparities. For example, when shown data that indicates a disparity between the incarceration rates of white and African American residents, it's important to get to the root cause of the why by examining historical structural racism and to challenge assumptions some people have about the perceived agency or choices of others. African American males are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than white males. If current trends continue, 1 of every 3 Black men born in America today can expect to go to prison in his lifetime. And African Americans are about 3 times more likely to be fatally shot by police than white people. The source of these disparities is deeper and more systemic than just overt racial discrimination. In addition to a flawed criminal justice system that works differently for wealthy people than it does for poor people and minorities, a number of factors contribute to the overrepresentation of Black people in the prison system. Economically segregated, under-resourced, and hyper-policed neighborhoods that we see today are the very same where discriminatory redlining practices intended to marginalize people of color were enforced in the 1930s and remain largely concentrated with households of color today. Black Americans, if arrested, then face implicit bias and racial discrimination throughout their engagement with the criminal justice system, from bail determinations to sentencing. Once minority defendants are convicted, they are likely to be sentenced more harshly than white defendants convicted for similar crimes. For example, let's consider 2 similar cases that ended in 2 very different outcomes. A 19-year-old white man robbed 3 men in Florida in 2008 during a drug deal. A year later, a 21-year-old Black man held up a Pizza Hut gas station, also in Florida. Both men pleaded no contest to 2 counts of armed robbery. They went before the same judge in the same courthouse. Each had a single misdemeanor on his record. They even tallied the exact same points on the score sheets used to determine criminal punishments in Florida. But their sentences could not have been more different. The white man spent less than 2 years in county jail. The Black man received a 26-year prison sentence and will be 47 when he is released. The prevalence of depictions of Black people as criminals throughout history and in mainstream media create implicit racialized bias, often validated by the rhetoric of elected officials, combined with racially inequitable policies and practices within the school system, housing and job markets, policing, and at all other levels of the criminal legal system, overlap to produce a system which disproportionately disciplines and imprisons Black people with longer sentences. As a community, it is critically important to acknowledge the historical role of government in creating and maintaining racial inequities. Through decisions about who could gain citizenship, who could vote, who could own property, and who could live where, government at all levels have influenced the distribution of advantage and disadvantage in American society. While Black Americans were being forced to provide free labor and being denied basic human rights, enslavers and others who benefited from slavery were accumulating generational wealth that continues to advantage their descendants today. The same pattern continues today within the prison industrial complex. So to combat the inequality or unequal access to opportunities that we see today, what approach should we take? Equality means to treat everyone the same, with evenly distributed tools and assistance. But treating everyone the same denies the history of structural oppression that negatively impacts the life outcomes of some groups and benefits other groups. You can see in the equality picture that both people have access to the same sized ladder, but because the tree is unequally positioned from the get-go, one person has more access to the apples than the other. Equity, however, means to treat everyone fairly, not necessarily the same, but fairly, by creating tools that identify and address inequality. You can see in the equity picture that the person on the right has a taller ladder than the person on the left, but because of the original unequal position of the tree, now the two both have equal access to the apples. Racial equity means that race can't be used to predict success and that we have successful systems that work for all, not just for white people. This means that sometimes different groups will be treated differently, but for the aim of eventually creating a level playing field that currently is just not the reality. Justice means fixing the system to offer equal access to both tools and opportunities. You can see in the justice picture that the tree's positioning has been corrected so that neither person requires a taller ladder than the other to reach the same number of apples. Justice is the real goal, but we focus on equity because we have a long road of correcting disparities before we reach justice. And because of America's reluctance to discuss systemic racism and the history of how we got here, people often cite not seeing color or work to create colorblind policies based on equal treatment. I mean, how many times have you heard someone say, well, I just don't see color? A colorblind approach to public policy can widen the disparities between groups because it neglects to account for the intergenerational impacts of state-sanctioned discrimination. For this reason, equity-centered policies that work to level the playing field must be targeted to address the specific needs of communities of color. And as a community, we must advocate for institutional policy reform that centers equity on the path to justice.
Welcome back. Would like to thank the YWCA for providing us with that incredible tool to use. The content in that sometimes is hard to watch, but ultimately it is really an incredible way to ground this conversation in some frameworks and some tools moving forward. Before we get started, I'd just like to revisit a few points made by Dr. Harrison. Today, we'll be walking through an analysis of geospatial and economic segregation based on race here in Central Ohio, moving into a conversation with some local experts and leaders, followed by another data presentation, looking at the aggregation of disparity within local school systems, which will be followed by a subsequent conversation, and then I'll wrap up after that. So before I get started, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Christy Angel. Christy is the president and CEO of the YWCA. After working at private and public sectors of Columbus for many years, Christy joined the YWCA in 2017. Christy has been an incredible partner, and we are very grateful to have her on this with us today. Christy, can you start your video and just wave for the audience? As we move forward with our panelists, I'd also like to just say thank you and introduce the panelists that we have with us here today. Joy Bivins, Deputy County Administrator for Health and Human Services at Franklin County Department of Job and Family Services, at Franklin County Board of Commissioners. We have Dr. Megan Johansson, who is a data analyst and insights manager at the Educational Service Center of Central Ohio. We have Dr. Tom Reed, who is the Executive Director of Data Research and Grants Advancement at the Educational Service Center of Central Ohio. Dr. Sierra Austin, the Regional School Improvement Coordinator for Equity and Diversity at the Educational Service Center of Central Ohio, and Mr. Melvin Brown, the Superintendent of Reynoldsburg City Schools. So it's great to see you all. Appreciate the good conversations that are going to follow. We're excited to have you here today to join with us, as Dr. Harrison said, in this coalition of the willing. Let's go ahead and pull up the presentation and we'll get started. So I just want to start off with a quote leaning into these slides. There's a country musician who said, "Some people feel the rain and others just get wet." The idea today is not to unpack all of the data that we're going to show, but to be informed and more aware, and through that awareness, build passion and let that passion catalyze action. So starting with the two maps we have on this slide, on the left, you'll see a redlining map of Central Ohio in the 1930s. This map shows where banks and lending industries would provide loans to folks to be able to purchase a home. The practice of redlining essentially was to literally draw red lines around neighborhoods where African Americans or communities of color lived, and they would not lend to them as a policy. You'll see to the map that we have on the right, the distribution of TANF eligibility by race. TANF is a proxy for poverty, TANF meaning tax assistance to needy families. And so as you can see in the darker purple areas, we have a high concentration of TANF eligible African American families. The point of this slide is just to show the incredible overlap of space and race and access to opportunity. Next slide, please. In this slide, we have three maps. One map showing historic redlining, one map showing the centralization of poverty by race through the proxy of TANF eligibility. And then on the right, we have Kirwan's opportunity index slide. This opportunity index shows us where relative opportunity is based within a region. And so as you can see at the bottom of the slide, very high opportunity is shown by darker areas and very low opportunity is shown by lighter areas. And so there is a correlation then between areas that were historically redlined, where current concentrations of poverty exist by race, and then also now where there are relatively low opportunities for people living within a certain region. One of the things that I want to point your attention to is this northwest quadrant of each map. We're going to revisit that shortly. Next slide, please. Here, I'd just like to show you all the distribution of household income within Franklin County. One of the things that spurred this map was thinking about the Dividing Line series that came out in the Columbus Dispatch in 2017. This series ranked Columbus or the region pretty low in the bottom 5 of the 50th largest metropolitan districts around measures of economic segregation and racial segregation. And so as you can see, as we go from left to right, the distribution or the concentration of poverty more diffused along the 71 I-70 corridor, again, areas that were historically redlined, looking at middle income kind of dispersed throughout the county, and then looking at high income, $3,334 and up per month, also kind of concentrated in that northwest corridor. One of the points I just like to stop and make is we move through these slides is that through the great video that we saw to lead into this, one of the things that they mentioned is that racism can be defined as a system. And so one of the things that's really sad to me is that over the course of 90 years or so, since we saw that 1932 redlining map to looking at some current data today, systems and policies have continued to reinforce within Central Ohio the relative distribution of wealth, the relative distribution of opportunity, the relative distribution of hope. And so we had to question, as the presenters told us, what are the policies that reinforce this? How can we think more holistically about this? And what can we do as a community to address some of these systemic issues? Next slide, please. This is a really interesting map that we ran across as we were doing research for this, coming from a group called Atlas or Opportunity Atlas with a researcher named Raj Chetty. So what this map is showing us is 30 years of longitudinal data, helping us to understand the relative earning potential based on where folks grew up. And so as you can see, the darker red area is looking at sort of lower earning potential over the course of one's life. The darker blue and the darker green areas are showing areas within the county that are going to experience higher relative growth over the course of their lives. So this map is looking at both white households and African-American households together. Next slide, please. This following slide is going to show us a map comparing the distribution of white families and Black families by adult outcomes or neighborhoods where they grew up. And so on the left, what you can see is there really is this dark red area again, following the I-71 and I-70 corridors, the areas that were historically redlined, and then also based on Kirwan's map, the areas that were also very low opportunity. And so as you can see here, there's a lot of folks living in these areas, a lot of white families living in these areas that are going to have relatively low household earnings over the course of their lives based on where they grew up. Interestingly, as we move to the right side of this slide, the map is showing us an area within the northwest quadrant again, where based on this 30 years of longitudinal data, there weren't enough African-American families living in these areas to be able to create a statistical model to project out what household earnings would look like. And so one of the things that we talk about a lot as we think about racism and as we think about the various forms that it's in, is really a focus on the personal, the individual, thinking about bad acts by bad actors. One of the real harms of institutional or systemic racism is that regardless of who is at the table of large institutions or leading large systems, these things tend to replicate themselves. And as they do, as people move in and out, one of the legacies that lives on is the racism that creates economic segregation and also racial segregation. And so as we think about what we can do, as we think about how we use this data to help us understand what this really looks like, we can expand our scope and our frame of reference to understand racism as an institution and then the effects of that on the people that are living in these areas. Next slide, please. So this is a table view of the data that we just looked at. And so what this shows us is really the strong predictive effect of one zip code based on their life outcomes. And so you can see on the left-hand side, you have neighborhoods going from Clintonville all the way to Worthington, and then comparing low-income Black children and then low-income white children and their relative earning potential over the course of their lives. And so there's one interesting data point here looking at Marion Franklin, where the racial earnings are inverted, where you have African-American kids expected to earn more. But generally in every other neighborhood that we're looking at, over the course of one's life, no matter if you start low income, middle income, or high income, white kids are going to make more than Black kids. And so you think about that, right? Earning potential is an interesting framework because it provides you with access and opportunity to a number of other resources along your life. Along the way, though, those same kids, those same Black kids are also going to experience more implicit bias as they apply for jobs, as they apply for loans, as they apply for apartments. They're also going to get targeted more in some instances, through criminal justice contacts. As we lean into our next block, they're also going to get disciplined at disparate rates. And so this income is interesting because it's also a proxy for some of the things that these kids will continue to experience over the course of their lives. One of the things that I bring to this conversation is being an African-American male, living in Franklin County, really vested in these issues. One of the things that I see in this research is myself and my family and my friends. And so while we have addressed a lot of data, one of the things that I hope, again, and I know we're moving fast, but is to think about this from a personal perspective. What does it mean for your neighbors, your friends, and the folks that you care about to see their relative earning potential, not based on their skills necessarily, but really the predictive effect of where they've grown up, and then tying that back into legacies that we absolutely need to work to dismantle. Next slide, please. This is the last slide that I have for this segment. And I wanted to end with this slide because I think that it's really, really, really important. So on the left, what we have is a scatter plot looking at the likelihood of a white child born in Franklin County, whether or not they'll be born into a family that's low income or a family that's high income. Essentially, what this data is telling us is that it's a coin flip. If you're born white in Franklin County, you have just as good of a chance of being born wealthy as being born poor. If you move to the right side of the slide, you're looking at a scatter plot of likelihood of being born in poverty by African-American children. What this shows us is that if you're born African-American in Franklin County, you have 3 times a greater likelihood of being born into poverty than your white peers, and then 1.5 times more likelihood than your Hispanic peers. And so looking back, right, as the video asked us to acknowledge into the past, we see that some of the same legacies, some of the same trends, some of the same ideologies that have reinforced what worth looks like and what value looks like continue to play themselves out, not just in the lives of adults, but also in the lives of children. I am so happy that you are here with us today, walking through really this quick overview of economic mobility, of racial segregation within the framework of systemic racism, so that together, as we lean into our November 5th session, we're able to start from a grounded place and then come together in a solutions-oriented focus. So at this point, we're going to turn it over to our panelists. I look forward to hearing from them as they review the data. In our next segment, Christy Angel and Joy Bivins are going to discuss the intersection of racism and current disparities within Central Ohio. They will discuss current data around disparity within Franklin County, providing important and humanizing context for the conversation that follows. Christy and Joy, thank you.
Thank you, Charles. And I would like to welcome and reintroduce Deputy County Administrator for Health and Human Services, Joy Bivins. Joy has served in numerous executive positions with Franklin County, and she's also been a member of the Whitehall City Schools board as well. So let's jump right into this, Joy. First and foremost, we just reviewed a lot of data, and we look at this data. We know there's a story, there's a face, that goes along with the data. So share with us from your point of view, what's the human story in this data, given the work that you've done?
So thank you, Christy, and thank you, Charles and Dr. Harrison and the members of the Compact and Columbus State for having me today. When I look at this data, like many of us that are watching, if I can just say this, Christy, I would hope when we look at this data that we feel an emotion, first of all. This is not, this data is analytical, but it should cause an emotional feeling in many of us because it's sad. It's sad to see that children who are Black are 3 times more likely to be born poor and stay poor in this county versus their white counterparts. What does that do to us as educators and adults who are charged with providing hope to young people and telling them that they can be anything in the world that they possibly can? But when you look at the data, depending on where you live, your earning potential is limited. Mm-hmm. So where is the hope in that? And what can we do about it?
Mm-hmm. You're exactly right. And I know that you, the commissioners and you and many others, some of us on this call today, have been involved in looking at poverty reduction in particular. And we've been looking at some of those zip codes and that data that we just saw. So can you just share with us a little bit about kind of the blueprint, the Rise Together blueprint, and kind of where we had to start before we can even get to poverty reduction, and then maybe talk a little bit about where we need to go.
So I'm going to have to ask you to redirect me to the question because I'm so full right now because of that data. I
know.
So what the commissioners did a couple of years ago in 2018, the end of 2018, they came and they said, we are expected to have an additional 1 million people added to our county population in the next 10 to 20 years, right? So we're at 1.3 million people. Sounds great. The problem is because growth, we always tout growth, right? This is a great community that has Fortune 500 companies, thriving businesses. All that is wonderful. However, when you looked at the data to see who was being impacted by poverty, I think the unemployment rate at that time pre-COVID was 4%. But when you peel the onion back, it was 16% for people of color and 29% for particularly Black people and brown people. So they asked us to come together and to pull together a unified plan because we have great organizations doing so much work from the nonprofit perspective, from the business perspective, from the government perspective, but people continue to fall through the cracks. And we were touting our growth. So there was something wrong. So we did an RFP. We engaged with a company to assist us in developing the poverty blueprint plan. But where we started, we didn't start with people on high level of administrations to tell us about people living in poverty, especially if you're not even driving in those neighborhoods, you're not communing, you're not breaking bread with people in poverty. We started with people who actually live in poverty. We had over 200 conversations around the county from everyone from new American citizens to single moms, single dads. We went into the jailhouses. I went into homeless camps, and we basically asked them three questions. What are we doing wrong? What are we doing to help? And what can we do to assist to move you up the economic mobility ladder? Mm-hmm. From that, we pulled in all of our stakeholders from around the county to flush out these conversations. And from those conversations, there were 5 themes, I believe. One, housing, transportation, everything we already know, education. But what kept rising to the cream of the top was the issue of racism. And you would think it would be people that look like me would bring that conversation up when we were having conversations with people living in poverty. But it was our white counterparts who were saying there is an issue of race in this county. There's an issue of race in this system. So the commissioners made it a point to deal with the first thing first, the issue of race. So they contracted with the Racial Equity Institute, and we had several trainings with several stakeholders and leaders from around the county in government, business, nonprofit, from the Racial Equity Institute. And we started with the 400 years of slavery during that training. It was a very emotional training. I think what we found was policies that we thought were really helping, like GI Bills and all these things where people can, get a part of the American dream. What we found was we have built a system to lock people out based on race and based on not only just personal and individual, and then it perpetuates the systemic racism. Mm-hmm. So this poverty blueprint plan has allowed us to align our efforts in what we're doing so that the people who are being impacted by poverty have a voice, and we're in the room, we're working truly for them because we're doing exactly what they asked us to do.
Mm-hmm. And so I imagine, if we go back to that slide, equality, equity, justice, right? Where do you see this blueprint work? Are we trying to achieve equity and ultimately justice? Are we trying to fix some of these systems? Because, you spend a lot of money every year trying to aid those who need those supports, housing, workforce, food insecurity, all those things. So where is Job and Family Services and you in your new role? Are you going to be focusing on the equity, or are we going to get to justice?
I think we need to focus on equity first, because equity is the gushing wound right now. And then once we can address that and tourniquet that, then we can get to justice. Mm-hmm. But right now we have to make things equitable for everyone. In Job and Family Services and in my new role, public assistance benefits, they do exactly what the policies intend them to do. It is a very transactional, it's transactional work. It's needed work, and I value all of our case managers that do it every day, and our residents who need those services. We want to make sure we provide those core services, but it's transactional work. Because you're underemployed and because your employer does not offer health care, the policy states that you are supposed to provide us with documentation so that you can receive these core benefits, and we do just that, right? However, there are certain parts of our business that work on trying to move people off of the public assistance roles. But unfortunately, due to policy, it is very restrictive in doing that, especially when if I take $1 raise, I'm going to lose my childcare, and my childcare is my most expense, my highest expense. How does that help anyone? So we're really trying, again, to deal with the equity and then get to justice. Mm-hmm. And in my new role, I'm trying to align all these systems so that we're working collectively together in addressing the same policies and barriers for families.
Mm-hmm. You're speaking, to my heart, right? The system is designed, the system's doing exactly what the system was designed to do. And so we've got to break the system, basically. Right. And we've got to fight for change in the system. And so, it's not lost on me that there's a lot of work to be done. And, I know the blueprint wasn't designed to only be owned by Franklin County. Can you just talk a little bit more, I think for the audience, especially, to understand that they too can have a role in making this, making this work?
So I'm going to do a shameless plug, because of course I always have a copy in hand. So this is the Franklin County Poverty Blueprint. This is we call it the People's Plan. This is the plan that the people assisted us with putting together to hear the voices of those who are living in poverty. And if you would like to be a part of the work that is going on, you can go to the Franklin County website, Franklin County Commissioner's website. There is a link on there that connects you to the plan to learn more information about it. But again, it's not just government. It is business, it's nonprofit, it is community leaders. We've brought every stakeholder to the table to assist us in moving this plan forward.
Yeah.
And there is now an innovation center that will be established from this plan.
And I think that's why we're here today. I think that's why, thank you, Dr. Harrison and Charles, for inviting us to have this conversation, because part of the reason why we are here today is for those who are watching and participating in this Zoom call, is that we can invite them into the work, because education leaders in particular, we definitely want them in the work, because as you mentioned, it's one of the 5 points that was referenced. If there's something that someone can do today or start doing tomorrow, whether they're in their classroom or at their kitchen table, what advice would you have for them?
So, I think if they're at their kitchen table, if they're in their classroom, everyone has a sphere of influence. So many times when you talk about the issue of racism and equality, it is easy to expect people of black and brown, or women, or LGBTQ to talk about the woes of the issues that we face, right? Mm-hmm. But we need this region, this country, we need those who do not look like me, the majority community, to challenge their sphere of influences in this area. For people who say that they don't see color, that's a problem. You have to see color. And you have to understand that everyone has implicit bias. So speak up, lean in, engage in the work, and don't just explain something away based on what you perceive your own implicit bias to be. And I'm going to touch on this really quick, because this was one of the slides in the agitator. The Tamir Rice case. The little boy had a gun, a toy gun, in the park. The police officer pulled up, and unfortunately that young man is no longer with us. We put guns in hands of hunters, and deer receive more patience in order to be shot at than that young man. Someone needs to speak up and say that is wrong. What we did as a country, we explained it away. We said, well, his mama shouldn't have bought him a gun. Well, why not? People played with guns when they were younger. You can buy them in a toy store. Mm-hmm. So I think what we need to do is speak up, use our voices, get involved in the work, and not just explain things away. All things are not racist. All people are not racist, but a lot of us have implicit bias that need to be challenged because it impacts systems.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You're right. And that Tamir Rice story is always one that gets me. And there's a lot of, it's kind of our final question, but, there's a lot of energy right now being spent around diversity and inclusion and equity. And, we're getting some momentum finally, right? Many of us have been in this work, and now we're getting investment and we're getting interest. So in an ideal scenario, beyond what you just mentioned, what else can we do to deepen equity work, especially, again, back to, especially education. You were on the board of education, you understand that. What else can we do?
I think what we really need to do, I think training is phenomenal. And I think, the trainings that we've all been going through, it is just the first tier. It's probably just pre-first tier. Mm-hmm. But it's now time to put action to the things that we have been, we've sat in the training, we heard the speaker, we've had great speakers from around the country, we've read the book, bought the button and the t-shirt, right? Now, what are you going to do, right? Are you going to challenge policy? Are you going to change policy? Are you really going to take a deep dive into those policies that really impact people of color, that have impacted us for 20, 30, 40, 50, 400 years? Mm-hmm. And it's the same demographic of people in the same social terms of health that continue to fall behind. Mm-hmm. We cannot explain that away. There is something wrong with the system. Mm-hmm. So if I could change the system, I would challenge all of us to start taking action, right? So we look at our healthcare system, right? Many times, people of color and unfortunately, people who are underemployed have to utilize Medicare because their employer does not offer Medicaid. There's so many verifications, and we have to go through it. You get it, but we demonize people who have to utilize it, and many times those are the people who are underemployed. Why not challenge the system and go to the employer and say you need to pay more, right? That's the issue. I wouldn't have to use it if I was getting paid more. Right. And then we demonize parents who have to work 2 or 3 jobs. They're not spending time with their kids, so their kids are acting up in school. And Mrs. Bivins doesn't care about her kids because she doesn't show up for parent-teacher conference. Mrs. Bivins has to work 2 jobs just so she can get that health care.
Mm-hmm.
So it's time to take action and challenge policies that impact people who fall, first of all, who are impoverished and who are impacted by racist systems.
Wholeheartedly agree. And we've got to practice now what we're learning. And we've got to continue to deepen our knowledge, but we do have to practice what we're learning. And we have to, when we see those inequities, we've got to call those things out, in a way in our organizations that allow us to say, I always say, don't bring me a problem without a solution to my team. And it's the same thing, right? We have to start looking at those policies and saying, let's start talking about some solutions to those policies that are inequitable. This has been, a great conversation, and we could be here all day talking about this. Hopefully, we'll get invited back to go a little bit deeper, especially, Director Bivins, as you, Deputy Administrator Bivins, I have to get used to the new title, especially as you open the Innovation Center and start to really put into practice and move forward on the blueprint. And we can come back and perhaps give updates on that and share how more of our educators can get involved in this, in the process.
Christy, can I say this really quick before we switch over? Sure. I would challenge everyone, it's easy to explain it away. It's easy to say, well, everyone has an opportunity to thrive in this community, and look at the data. If nothing else, look at the data. If you're in a room and the room looks like everyone in the room looks like you should raise your hand and say, wait a minute, we can't have this conversation about anything until we diversify the room. And then welcome the perspectives that are coming into the room, because they're bringing a perspective that you do not have.
Thank you very much. You have the final word. Thank you. Thank you so much. Charles, I'll throw it back to you.
Hopefully I keep my job, Charles.
I'll call your bosses and make sure we're good. Well, thank you so much, Christy and Joy, for a really exceptional conversation. At this point, we're going to introduce Dr. Megan Johansson and Dr. Tom Reed to walk us through our next data presentation.
Thank you, Charles. Appreciate that. Christy, thank you for your leadership and facilitation and guidance in that previous session. Megan and I are really going to focus on the youth opportunity data. And we're going to look at this in 2 different ways. One, Megan is going to focus on some of the school factors that we see. And this is regionalized data. So we've taken this out to a regional perspective and sometimes a state perspective. And keep in mind, this is only the data that we can actually publicly available. So, if you're in a school district, you have deeper insight to your own context. And we encourage you to use this as a launching point and hopefully spark some questions in yourselves about your own context and how do you compare to what you're seeing here. So I'm gonna yield to Megan, and Megan will walk us through the school factors.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about 2 different pieces of education data: graduation rates and then disciplinary occurrences. We're looking at the Central Ohio region, which for today we've defined as all of the districts in Franklin, Delaware, and Union County. We're also looking at trend data, as you'll see in these charts, going back to the 14-15 school year at 2-year intervals. So first, the graduation rate. We've broken it down into different subgroups here. And on the left, you can see a race ethnicity chart. What we see here is that the percentage of white students that graduate over time has remained higher than the students of color graduation rates. That's what the SOC label is there. And in the 18-19 school year, there was about a 4 percentage point difference in graduation rate between students of color and white students. Moving next to the center chart, you can see that female students have had a consistently slightly higher graduation rate than male students. And over on the right, the economically disadvantaged students have had consistently lower percentage rates of graduation than the non-disadvantaged students. Although in the most recent years, we do see that gap has decreased slightly. Although I would point out that it looks like part of this decrease in the gap is due to the non-disadvantaged students going a little bit down in their graduation rates. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to talk about disciplinary occurrences by race ethnicity compared to the percent of enrollment. So you can see we've got sets of bar charts here, starting with 2014, 16, and 18. The pattern is pretty consistent, so I'm just going to focus on the 2018 bar charts. What we can see here is that although in the gray bar, students of color make up less than half of the students enrolled in these districts, they account for 73% of the disciplinary occurrences in the 2018-19 school year. That's a 28% gap between the students of color enrollment and discipline. Next slide, please. Now can we go back one slide? Okay, now we're looking at the same breakdown by gender. So again, we see a consistent pattern over the years, so I'm going to focus on the 2018 chart. Female and male students are about 50-50 for their enrollment in these districts, but male students make up 68% of the disciplinary occurrences. So that is a gap of 16% between enrollment and discipline. Next slide, please. And the final comparison I'm going to talk about is for students that are economically disadvantaged compared to those that are not. Again, we see a similar pattern across time. So focusing on the 2018 chart, we see that about half of the students in our districts, 46%, were economically disadvantaged in 2018. But we see a disproportionately high number of students, of economically disadvantaged students accounting for the disciplinary occurrences. This is a 40% gap between enrollment of economically disadvantaged students and disciplinary occurrences. Next slide, please. And now Tom will take over.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. So I'm going to take a look at a few non-school factors, and I'm going to lay them against what we just saw from Megan. So Megan shared with us the school discipline occurrences. There was this disproportionality between the percentage of numbers of students of color in the enrollment and the number of discipline occurrences. And what you see is really almost the exact same trend, the exact same disproportionality in the juvenile justice system. So whether it's in school or outside of school, we see this. This is going on, and you know, a really stark contrast in numbers. So there's that. Next slide, please. Another thing that I pulled out here were adverse childhood experiences. So going back to the discipline data, if we isolate just fighting and violence and serious bodily injury as you know, violent occurrences in school, there are certainly many categories in which discipline occurrences are counted. But for these two, if we consider these the violent occurrences in schools, what we note is that almost 80%, almost you know, 4 out of 5 occur to students of color. So again, we see, and these numbers right here are from a national statistic from the CDC. But again, we see the disproportionality that students of color are much more likely to suffer adverse childhood experiences than their white counterparts or white peers, both in school and out of school. Next slide, please. Thank you. And the final slide of this data, this is back to a school-based data, but this is a regionalized look at industry credentials, the average percentage of students earning industry credentials in school. And I pulled this out by region, by metropolitan region. And what you see here is that the Columbus region kind of falls in the middle between you know, Toledo, Cincinnati, and Dayton, a little bit ahead. Cleveland is fairly close, about 0.14% difference, and then Akron is much lower. And then on the left side of that, what you see in the negative, that the minus numbers, that's how much below the state average we are for all districts in the state of Ohio. What is notable about this, and this is a statewide statistic, we don't have access to these data by region, by race and ethnicity, but statewide, what we can see is that white students earn industry credentials much higher percentage than students of color, 6.4% to 4.4%. So those are some data that we felt was important to present, both school factors and non-school factors. Megan, I appreciate all the work that you did pulling the school work together. And now, Charles, I'm going to throw it back to you and or to Christy, and Christy will lead a conversation with Melvin Brown and Sierra Austin about what these mean.
Thank you so much, Tom and Megan. We appreciate the time you put into that presentation. I'm really interested in the Toledo data and how Toledo got to where they are, but we'll check back on that. That's something that is of interest to me. I would like to welcome our next panelist, Superintendent Melvin Brown and Dr. Sierra Austin. Sierra Austin is the Regional School Improvement Coordinator for Equity and Diversity at the Educational Service Center of Central Ohio. And I also have to have a shameless plug. She is what we call a YWCA baby. She started in our program, I think, in high school and worked here throughout quite a bit of her career. She's a published author and has been awarded several grants. Welcome, Dr. Austin. So much fun to say that. And then Melvin Brown is the superintendent of the Reynoldsburg City Schools. Melvin previously worked as the deputy superintendent of Cuyahoga Falls City Schools, and he is soon to also earn that title, Dr. Melvin Brown. So if I slip, I'm starting to practice that, but welcome, Superintendent Brown. So we just saw this data, and there's a lot to unpack, right, in the data. But the first thing, and you know, both of you can answer this question, but certainly I know that the superintendent will be able to answer this. Can you help us kind of understand what it's like from a student's perspective? You know, if you think about the student in this data, like what is that like?
I think for many of our kids, they feel the consequences of that data, even when they aren't part of it, so to speak. They tend to see kids who look like them get into certain situations and assume that they're supposed to do the same thing, or that's how people look at them. So I think in many respects, that then translates to how staff may treat them. I think there's some disparities in that regard. We often talk about the fact that we in education often have a deficit thinking sort of frame of mind in which we look at what kids can't do, not what they can do. We never ever respect the assets that they bring to the table. We make judgments about their home lives and how parents' life structures may be. And that puts kids in spaces in which they don't feel like they belong or that they're connected. And I think all those pieces, our kids know it. And I think it's important that we're able to reach to them and get them to see that we want them to be, this is their school, these are their schools as well. And we have to be able to design structures and supports that allow them to see that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Sierra, do you have anything you want to add there? I see you nodding your head.
Sure, I would absolutely agree with that. And I think in addition to looking at the qualitative data, looking at the quantitative data that we have and that we've discussed today, you know, what would happen if we rethink the way we conceptualize literacy, right? Our students have a very astute understanding of what's going on. And we often think about literacy as simply reading or writing or something to be measured, right? But we have this phenomenal body of research that kind of proves that the way in which our students understand issues of race, understand issues of racism and police brutality, how they make sense of everything that we've experienced over the past few months is a form of literacy, and that they have very astute and intellectual things to kind of say and how they make meaning of these things. But we're not giving them a lot of space to have these conversations within a school context. So I think for it's very important to, you know, have the opportunity and have the space to talk about these issues. Again, they have a very astute understanding of what's going on. And we need to really understand their knowledge and meaning making as a form of literacy, although it's not something that can be measured in the classroom or measured on a standardized test.
Mm-hmm. And how, when you mentioned, you know, kind of what students are going through right now and, you know, that being included kind of in their learning and literacy, how could how can we have a more intentional focus? I mean, I'm thinking about this, the ACEs, right, and or the trauma-informed care. How can that kind of how can that be incorporated into learning? Because I've got to imagine with all that we're going through, 2 pandemics and so forth, different types of learning, hybrid, virtual, et cetera. I mean, there's a lot of trauma, and we know that COVID-19 has laid bare inequities, especially for Black and Brown children. So can you talk a little bit, either of you, about how we can include a more intentional focus on trauma-informed care in the education system?
Sure. So I think we have a large body of research that shows us the importance of culturally responsive teaching practices and how important those are for students. I also think that it's important to approach these interventions in a way that is intersectional, right? So we're not just talking about race, we're talking about gender, we're talking about class, we're talking about ability and so on. But that intersectional focus kind of forces us to look at all those oppressions simultaneously and create very unique remedies for what our students are experiencing. And that can really help us to kind of break down this harmful legacy of oppression that we've been talking about during our time together today. But I think that in addition to that social emotional learning piece is key. And as the CEO from Activists and Agitators shared, we're talking about disrupting and dismantling a legacy of systems that have been around for a long time, right? And so it's going to take those intersectional approaches. It's going to take that social emotional learning piece to kind of start to begin to disrupt and dismantle these systems.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Superintendent Brown, as we looked back, in the beginning part of this, and we had the YWCA video, the paper folding exercise, it's not lost on me and probably others that, historical, legally sanctioned racial segregation and kind of the, was supposed to end, so to speak, with Brown versus Board of Education, and we know that those it was never fully realized, especially in Central Ohio. Right, I'm a child who remembers desegregation in Columbus, Ohio, very very vividly. Friends being told they have to go to different schools and not their neighborhood schools, and all of that. Ideally, what issues would you tackle or are you tackling to mitigate the harm of kind of the systemic racism on students kind of in your district?
Well, one of the things we have to recognize about the history of that is when in 1954, when Brown versus Board took place and the efforts to desegregate schools, that was noble and I applaud it. But at the same time, we didn't take steps to then deconstruct some of those barriers that neighborhoods faced. So while solving one problem, you failed to solve the bigger problem that may be encapsulating all of that. So that's one of the things I think we need to pay homage to. Within our district, what we're starting to do is we're having real conversations. Now, when I arrived a few years back, we began to talk about disparities in our student data and our suspensions and expulsions. We had those conversations, but I felt like we were kind of on the fringes of just touching issues and not necessarily diving deeply into them. This past spring, when all of the things took place across our country, when we began to push back on some of these oppressive systems, it opened up some room and some space for schools to have real conversations with real detail and real specifics that we actually looked to tackle. So we did some work over the summer and in the early fall to get some understanding of why we are where we are, why these structures exist. It isn't just someone decided to wake up yesterday and put all these things in place. This is all historical. And if we don't recognize the historical nature of how these things have been established, we'll never really appreciate how harmful those things are now. That's why I think it's so easy for people to say things like, oh no, we don't have racism here, that doesn't exist. Well, let's look at the system. If the system, and I think Joy said this earlier, the system's doing what it was designed to do. So we have to deconstruct the system and make it work for all kids. We know going back to the genesis of education, the very outset of our country, it was never designed for all kids. We know that, but yet we don't ever recognize those features and the fact that we still hold on to so much of that history in what we do every day. So COVID-19 has obviously presented some unique challenges that we've all had to go through, but it also gives us some unique opportunities to remake what education looks like.
Mm-hmm. And you make such a good point. You know, I have that vivid, picture in my head of, the schools being integrated. And, we all have the pictures of, there are police officers or sheriffs or, what have you, trying to, open up the doors and, let the students of color, into the school. And yet, once they walked in that school, everything didn't just all of a sudden change, right? Hearts and minds didn't change. The system itself didn't change. The books, none of that changed. And over time, there have been some improvements. But again, I always say it's the tinkering around the edges because we never really deconstructed it to say, okay, now what's it look like to really have a system that is for everyone, right? And that's why we have some of the data that we have today. I think it's also important for us to always go back to when we talk about the systems, we're talking about the systems. We're not necessarily talking about the people, because we don't want people to think it's not about calling the individuals out or they didn't create these systems. These were long before us. And so that brings me to the disciplinary that we saw and some of that data around discipline, which is also alarming. The disciplinary kind of the occurrences by race and gender, and so forth. And, what drives those numbers?
I think there's so many factors that are involved in that. I think we talked earlier about kids not having a sense of belonging when they come to school. So if they don't think the school cares about them, then why should they care about the school in turn? We look at our staff composition. We know many kids of color don't get to see many adults who look like them. I always talk about the fact that if kids can't see it, they can't be it. And if they don't have those opportunities, it stunts their growth. I think back on my own education, I had quite a few Black men who were either my teachers or my principals, and they were very, very responsible for the things I do right now. And I talk about them all the time. Many of our kids don't get to see that. We think about the fact we have so many oppressive things that happen in schools. Traditionally, we've accepted to be the norm. We can think about how oppressive some of our dress codes are. And we're trying to do some work in that regard. Expectations for kids, we just assume because kids come from a poor background or whatever neighborhood that there's certain things they can't do. That's not the case. We need to be able to recognize kids bring talents to the table regardless of what their backgrounds are. Underrepresentation in gifted ed, AP, and College Credit Plus, because we don't have those conversations with those kids to say, hey, I see something in you, and this is something I'm encouraging you to pursue. We just let them make those decisions alone by themselves without any guidance. Our curriculum doesn't reflect any diversity, and that's something else that we need to really take a look at. We'll be doing some work on that this year in Reynoldsburg. And then I think an overall lack of respect of students' lived experiences. We look at those experiences and pity them and not necessarily recognize what those things are and allow them to see what their circumstances are and give them tools to be able to move on and not necessarily to say that their lives are so bad, so to speak.
Yes, you're exactly right. Dr. Austin?
Yes, and I would just add that a lot of that is rooted in those implicit biases that we briefly talked about earlier. So everyone has those biases, and it's our responsibility to find out where they are, right? There are tools and resources to find out what our biases are. And then it's our responsibility to consistently and constantly unlearn them and work on them, right? There's no simple way around that. It's not a one and done type of staff training situation, but it's something that you have to consciously be working at in a process of unlearning that is continuous. It's never done.
You're exactly right. We spend a lot of time here at YWCA Columbus talking about that and checking for our biases and try to unlearn them because we all have them. And so to our listening audience or viewing audience today, what are some of the things that they can do? I asked Joy Bivins this as well. What can they do in their classroom? Where can they start today or tomorrow if they want to begin to dismantle some of these kind of oppressive systems or what have you? What is it? What advice would you have for them? We'll start with you, Sierra, and then we'll go to the superintendent.
Sure. I would also kind of just say, along with the implicit bias piece, take that Harvard University Implicit Association test and find out where those biases lie. There's a lot of cognitive and neurological research that's been done about how our brain tries to take these shortcuts and how we use our identities and lived experiences to make sense of the world around us, which we do very fast. I think we can process about 20 bits of information every few seconds, but we get 11 million bits, right? So that's a lot. And our brain likes to take shortcuts. So find out where those blind spots are. And there's tons of research out there on ways that you can kind of check yourself and then work to check and call in rather than call out the people around you, your family, your friends, your colleagues, et cetera.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
I think that's such a great point. I think it's important that we not only identify our biases, but accept the fact that we have them and work on them. I think whenever biases are called out or is called in, I like that, Sarah. Whenever they're put into question, people get defensive. We all have them. And if we can recognize those things on the very front end, we can all work together through things. I would encourage people to read and watch as many documentaries as you possibly can. There's so much material out there that you can consume. Anything I've learned, I did not learn when I was in school. I've learned it since then, and I enjoy it even now. Just read and consume as much information as you can to get a sense of why are we here today. It isn't just in 2020 that these things began to exist. How do those things from the past still render true now? We don't ever talk about those things.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You know, you mentioned the reading now, and I guess I would ask both of you, the scholars that you are, what are you reading now?
Right now, I'm reading. It's called Slavery's Capitalization. It has a lot to do with the fact of how all that took place, setting forth what the business. How we look in terms of industry and business in the United States and how those things were all grounded in slavery. I'd recommend the new Jim Crow for anybody who's interested in trying to find out the legal ramifications. The Color of Law talks very much about how law has been developed and all these things have been legislatively put in place. There's just a ton of material out there.
There is. Sierra?
So I agree with all of those book recommendations. I'm currently reading Caste,
So am I.
which is right here on my desk.
Best book I've ever read. Phenomenal.
Highly recommend, and it really gets kind of at the heart of the social construction of race and how, although it is a social construction, it has these very real implications for us and our communities and our students. So highly recommend.
Yeah, my husband and I are both reading it. It's quite a book. There's a lot, so it's kind of the race to see who's going to finish it first, but we have some interesting conversations around it. And I would say to our audience, I know that Columbus State and Charles Noble, they have sent out the link to the YWCA's Activists and Agitators, the full link. The Color of Law is referenced in that link. I believe there's a link to the Harvard Implicit Bias test. If not, we'll make sure that we get that link to all the participants today so that they can take advantage of that. And we also have a discussion guide that we'll make sure all the participants get, and it covers a number of the books that both Superintendent Brown and Dr. Austin and I have discussed, plus there are other videos and there's some specific education material that also is, material for educators that's also included. And we'll make sure that we share those links broadly with our participants today. I want to thank Superintendent Melvin Brown and Dr. Sierra Austin for joining us today. It's been great. Again, I think the three of us plus Joy, we could have a whole day of conversation. And I always like to say, hopefully we'll get to come back and talk more about our work. But thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much.
Charles?
I'll connect with Dr. Harrison, but I believe that everybody is invited back for additional conversation. Thank you, Christy, Sierra, and Melvin for joining us today and helping us to round this panel out. We have a few updates that I want to provide, but first, let's just recap a little bit. We talked about systemic racism. We talked about privilege. We talked about the intersections of these things at race and gender, with history, with mobility. And so please, as our last panelists have described, do some research. Anything that we can provide, please let us know, and we will certainly do that. On November 5, we're going to be connecting this current panel that we have to a discussion on industry practices, both within K-12 and then within business, higher ed, and some other industries. And so we would really love for you to join us so that we can translate what we've heard, some of the data, and hear how industry practitioners are trying to move these things forward through that data lens. And I'd like to just wrap up with saying that we have a survey coming out soon. Please be on the lookout for that survey. It's going to ask you about your responses or your feedback for this session. Would love to know more about how you feel. And then finally, just want to thank you all and the Compact, Dr. Harrison, the leadership, for allowing us to walk into this new frontier with you. The pandemic has showed us that we are all more interconnected sometimes than we understand. And so let's use this as an opportunity to continue to move forward. Thank you all. Looking forward to all of your participation on November 5. Thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.